A judge mocked Karoline Leavitt in open court, but within minutes, Attorney General Pam Bondi stormed in and had him handcuffed. His own signature exposed his role in a massive election fraud scheme with Daniel Rivera. What unfolds next will leave you speechless. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and hit subscribe to catch every twist of this jaw-dropping story. Karoline Leavitt stepped into the courtroom in Maricopa County, Arizona. Her eyes sharp, her demeanor poised, an image not to be underestimated. At 27, she was the youngest White House press secretary in history, and today she was representing the Trump administration to confront a major election fraud case. The defendant, Daniel Rivera, a powerful election official with deep political ties, stood accused of manipulating voter rolls to sway a critical swing state election. From the bench, Judge William Hayes watched her with cold caution. Leavitt was no stranger to pressure. She had weathered the storm of media and political scrutiny throughout her career. Though her youth had once been questioned, she knew this was different. This was a fight for democracy. And she understood that Hayes wasn't just a tough judge. He was notorious for his sharp tongue and unpredictable rulings. Hours earlier, Pam Bondi had warned Leavitt, "Hayes got something shady about him. Be careful with him." Leavitt approached the plaintiff's table holding a thick stack of documents, altered voter records, suspicious deletions, and a signature that raised her suspicions. The eyes of the jury, reporters, and Daniel Rivera, who wore a confident smirk, followed her every move. But then Judge Hayes spoke, his voice calm yet commanding. "Ms. Leavitt, I must ask, what is the White House's intent in sending someone as young as you here? This is a courtroom, not a press room." The courtroom fell into a brief silence after Judge William Hayes' opening remark, quickly broken by a faint chuckle from Daniel Rivera's defense attorney. Leavitt, unfazed, raised her chin slightly as Hayes began again, his deep, steady voice resonating with the authority of a veteran judge. "I trust you've come prepared to present before this court today. This is a place of law, and I expect you to bring grounded arguments." He tapped his hand lightly on the bench, his gaze fixed on her as if reminding her he controlled this courtroom. Leavitt nodded slightly, resting her hand on the documents before her, her fingers brushing the first page as a quiet affirmation. "Your Honor," she replied, her voice clear and firm, cutting through the murmurs from the back rows. "I'm here to present the truth. Daniel Rivera tampered with thousands of votes, and I have the evidence to prove it." She opened the file, pulling out a voter roll marked in red. This is a record from Rivera's office showing 10,000 voters illegally removed from a key district, all favoring one candidate. Judge Hayes furrowed his brow, his arms crossed over his chest, his calm demeanor masking a hint of skepticism. "Voter records," he said, his tone even but tinged with scrutiny, "are something this court has reviewed in many cases before. I expect you can clearly explain what these numbers mean rather than just displaying them." A small laugh came from the defense attorney, a middle-aged man in a gray suit, his hair neatly combed. Daniel Rivera sat beside him, hands clasped, the corner of his mouth twitching upward, as if he believed everything was still under control. Leavitt took a deep breath, keeping her composure. She knew Judge Hayes was testing her, subtly but pointedly questioning her confidence. "Your Honor," she continued, her voice rising slightly for emphasis, "if I may, I'll explain. This removal of 10,000 voters has no legitimate justification, no verification process, no oversight. Furthermore, we have witness testimony confirming Rivera ordered these changes to rig the election." She held up the paper, her eyes locked on Judge Hayes. He tilted his head, his eyes narrowing as if weighing her words. "Witness testimony and documents," he said, his voice lowering, "are elements that require careful scrutiny for authenticity. I trust what you're presenting isn't mere speculation, Miss Leavitt." He tapped his hand lightly on the bench, his gaze sweeping the room, reinforcing his control. "Proceed, but I expect clarity and focus." The courtroom grew tenser. A female juror in the front row, wearing a dark blue jacket, frowned at Judge Hayes as if sensing the rigidity in his tone. A reporter whispered to a colleague, "He's giving her a hard time," but Leavitt didn't notice. She set the voter roll down. Karoline Leavitt pulled out a memo signed between Rivera's office and a local election board. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady, This memo authorizes a purge of 5,000 additional voters, but the criteria listed are fabricated. This isn't a clerical error, it's evidence of fraud." Judge William Hayes interrupted, his voice ringing with sternness. "Miss Leavitt, I must ask you to be cautious with such accusations," he said, his tone warning. "This court doesn't tolerate hasty conclusions. If you intend to argue fraud, I expect you to provide more concrete evidence." He tapped his gavel lightly on the bench, the small sound a reminder of his authority. "Present more, but I won't tolerate imprecision." Leavitt stood still, her gaze unwavering. She sensed Hayes was trying to maintain the upper hand, forcing her to prove every minute detail, but she hadn't come here to back down. "Your Honor," she said, her voice sharp yet respectful, "I respect your demand for precision, so I propose the court closely examine these documents, and if needed, I'm prepared to request an independent audit to verify them." Her words were a polite challenge, silencing the courtroom. Daniel Rivera's defense attorney frowned, the smile on his face beginning to fade. Hayes leaned forward, his hands on the bench, his eyes locked on Leavitt. "You're suggesting an independent audit in my courtroom?" he asked, his voice low but carrying a warning. "I remind you, this is where I decide what's reviewed, Miss Leavitt. I expect you to understand your role in this process." He tapped his gavel again, his gaze unrelenting, as if trying to subdue her with his presence. Leavitt stood tall, unflinching. "Your Honor, I fully understand my role. To ensure the truth is fully presented to this court. With your permission, I'll proceed with further evidence." She pushed the documents forward, her eyes fixed on Hayes. "May we continue?" The air in the courtroom grew heavy, like the calm before a storm. The white ceiling lights cast a soft glow on Karoline Leavitt's poised figure at the plaintiff's table. She stood there, hands resting lightly on the documents, her gaze locked on Judge Hayes at the bench. He sat upright, arms crossed over his black robe, his stern face etched with deep lines, the marks of decades wielding justice. After Leavitt's final request to proceed, Hayes spoke, his voice deep and steady, carrying the weight of authority. "Miss Leavitt, I'll allow you to continue, but I expect you to present with the clarity and precision this courtroom demands." Leavitt nodded slightly, maintaining her professionalism. "Your Honor, I deeply appreciate your guidance," she replied, her voice ringing with confidence, drowning out the murmurs from the back. "I have no intention of presenting anything but the truth." She gave a faint smile, not to provoke, but to assert her control. The female juror in the dark blue jacket shifted in her seat, her eyes moving from Hayes to Leavitt, as if weighing who held the upper hand. Hayes tapped his hand lightly on the bench, his eyes narrowing. "The truth is what this court always seeks," he said, his tone even but edged with caution. "I've been in this position long enough to distinguish between grounded arguments and baseless accusations. Proceed, but I won't tolerate any conjecture." His tapping echoed steadily, like a drumbeat, reminding everyone of his power in the room. Leavitt drew a deep breath, keeping her breathing even. She knew Hayes wasn't just controlling the courtroom, he was testing her, forcing her to prove every detail under his strict scrutiny. She opened the file, pulling out a thicker email chain marked in red ink. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but weighty, "I present this email chain signed by Rivera, instructing a subordinate to delete voter registrations from a specific precinct. This document conceals an order to suppress 7,000 votes." She held it up, her voice unwavering. "We have server logs confirming the deletions." The courtroom stirred. The female juror in blue leaned forward, her eyes widening. Daniel Rivera at the defendant's table clenched his hands, his confident smile now a distorted curve. His defense attorney, the man in the gray suit, stood up. "Objection, Your Honor," he said, his voice firm but lacking its usual certainty, as if he felt the rising pressure. Judge William Hayes raised a hand, signaling the attorney to sit, his eyes never leaving Leavitt. "Miss Leavitt," he said, his voice lowering with gravity, "this court demands all documents be clearly authenticated before consideration. I expect you can provide the lawful origin of this evidence, not just rely on numbers." He tapped his gavel lightly, the small sound reinforcing his authority. "Explain clearly, if you can." Leavitt didn't waver. She set the email chain down, pulling out a server log with a digital timestamp. "Your Honor," she began, I respect your demand for authenticity. This is evidence legally obtained by the Justice Department, and I believe it addresses all your concerns. She held it up, her eyes fixed on Hayes. If I may ask, do you believe these documents need more time for review, or shall I proceed? Hayes leaned forward, hands on the bench, his sharp gaze piercing her. Are you questioning my process, Miss Leavitt? He asked, his voice low but laced with warning. I remind you that all evidence presented in this court must meet strict legal standards. I won't accept any ambiguity in your arguments. He tapped his gavel again, his eyes sweeping the room to assert his control. Leavitt stood tall, her gaze unflinching. She sensed Hayes was trying to maintain the upper hand, but she hadn't come here to yield. Your Honor, I fully understand the court's standards, she said, her voice sharp yet respectful. So with your permission, I propose pausing the trial to have these documents fully verified. A step I believe will clarify the truth. Her proposal struck Hayes like an arrow, causing him to lean back in his chair, his breathing growing heavier. Pause the trial? Hayes repeated, his tone even but tinged with doubt. You're requesting something unusual, Miss Leavitt. I remind you this is a trial under my direction, and I will decide when a pause is warranted. He tapped his gavel lightly, his eyes fixed on her. However, if you believe you have additional substantial evidence, I'll allow you to proceed, provided it's clear and convincing. The courtroom fell deathly silent. A reporter in the back row stopped writing, his pen hovering over the paper. The female juror in the blue jacket clenched her hands, her eyes locked on Leavitt. Daniel Rivera lifted his head, his anxious gaze darting to his attorney, who whispered something with a tense expression. Everyone could feel it. Something bigger was looming. Leavitt let the silence linger for a second, then reached down for another document, a call transcript marked confidential from the Justice Department. She didn't open it yet. She simply placed it on the table, her hand gently brushing the cover. Your Honor, she said, her voice low but piercing, I deeply appreciate your patience. With your permission, I'll present another piece of evidence, one I believe will resolve any doubts you have about this case. Hayes sat upright, his hands resting on the oak bench, his narrowed eyes observing her with cold caution. The courtroom was so quiet that Daniel Rivera's rapid breathing from the defendant's table rang out clearly. Hayes finally spoke, his voice deep and steady, carrying the weight of authority. Miss Leavitt, I've allowed you to continue. I expect your next piece of evidence to meet this court's rigorous standards. Leavitt let the silence stretch for a second, her eyes never leaving him. Then she reached to open the transcript, but a faint buzz from her coat pocket stopped her. She glanced down quickly, seeing a text flash on the screen. Hayes tied to deletions. Check the memo signature. J. Jake, the investigative reporter she'd worked with before, a man with consistently reliable sources. She took a deep breath, deciding to set aside the recording and pursue this new lead. Your Honor, she began, her voice calm but weighty. Before I present the transcript, I'd like to return to the memo I mentioned earlier. She pulled the document back from the table, flipping quickly to the last page where a black ink signature stood out among the fine print. This memo bears the approval signature of a senior official, she said, her voice clear. And I'd like to ask you, Your Honor, do you recognize this signature? She held up the document, her eyes locked on Hayes. He frowned, his hands gripping the edge of the bench for a second before relaxing. A signature, he replied, his tone even but questioning. Miss Leavitt, I don't make a habit of memorizing every stroke from the hundreds of documents that cross my desk. I expect you to provide a specific reason for me to consider this. His voice deepened, his gaze sweeping the room as if to remind everyone of his authority. Leavitt gave a faint smile, not to provoke, but to affirm she was on the right track. Your Honor, I deeply respect your caution, she said, her voice sharp yet reverent. I believe you'll recognize this signature because it's yours. William Hayes. She placed the document on the table, exposing the signature clearly for all to see. A reporter in the back whispered, "What the hell?" before being pulled back by a colleague. The female juror in the blue jacket covered her mouth, her eyes shifting from surprise to suspicion. Daniel Rivera snapped his head up, his panicked gaze darting to his attorney, who now leaned down to whisper something with a strained expression. But Judge William Hayes didn't react immediately. He sat still, his eyes glued to the document in front of him, his breathing growing heavier. "Miss Leavitt," he finally spoke, his voice low but carrying a warning, "I must ask you to be cautious with such accusations. This court isn't a place for baseless conclusions. I expect you to prove the lawful origin of that document." He tapped his gavel lightly, the small sound enough to bolster his authority. Leavitt didn't back down. She rested her hand on the table, her gaze steady. "Your Honor, I deeply appreciate your request," she said, her voice calm but cutting. "This document was obtained by the Justice Department through a lawful subpoena. Your signature is on an order to delete 7,000 votes from a contested precinct. If you will allow, I'm prepared to present further evidence to clarify this matter." She gestured toward the transcript still on the table, a reminder of the card she hadn't yet played. Judge Hayes leaned forward, his hands on the bench, his sharp gaze piercing her. "You're making a serious accusation, Miss Leavitt," he said, his voice deepening with gravity. "I remind you that all evidence presented in this court must comply with strict legal regulations. I won't accept the use of documents without full verification." He tapped his gavel again, his eyes fixed on her. Leavitt sensed Hayes trying to hold the upper hand, but Jake's message had changed everything. She felt a quiet surge of confidence. "Your Honor," she replied, her voice low but forceful, "if you doubt the document's authenticity, I propose pausing the trial for an independent agency to verify it, a step I believe will safeguard this trial's fairness." Her proposal cut like a sharp blade, causing Hayes to lean back in his chair, his breathing growing heavier. "Pause the trial?" Hayes repeated, his tone even but tinged with doubt. "You're requesting something unusual, Miss Leavitt. I remind you that I'm the one overseeing this trial, and I'll decide when such action is needed." He tapped his gavel lightly, his gaze sweeping the room as if to assert his control. Leavitt stood still, her eyes locked on him. Her mind flashed to memories of election disputes twisted by powerful judges. Hayes was no exception. He'd presided over dozens of voting cases, but his reputation wasn't entirely spotless. She flipped the document again, comparing the signature to another copy in the file. There was no doubt it was Hayes's signature, signed 3 months ago. She looked up, meeting his eyes directly. "Your Honor," she said calmly, her voice unwavering, "I believe we need to discuss this further, and I have a feeling the next piece of evidence will make you reconsider." The courtroom sank into stifling silence, broken only by the heavy breathing of Judge William Hayes from the bench. Karoline Leavitt stood at the plaintiff's table, her gaze as sharp as a blade, holding the document with Hayes's signature. Clear evidence of his connection to Daniel Rivera. She had just issued a warning, "I have a feeling the next piece of evidence will make you reconsider." Hayes sat still, his hands on the oak bench, his narrowed eyes observing her with cold caution. He said nothing, but the tension in the air was palpable. He was facing a dangerous situation. Leavitt took a deep breath, steadying her heartbeat. She knew this was the decisive moment, not just for the case, but for the credibility of the Trump administration she represented. She placed the document with Hayes's signature on the table, then slowly pulled the call transcript from the file. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and resonant, slicing through the silence like a sword. "I've presented your signature on the memo deleting 7,000 votes for Mr. Rivera and asked you to explain. Since you haven't responded, I'll let your own words clarify this matter." Judge Hayes leaned forward, his voice deepening with gravity. "Ms. Leavitt, I must ask you to proceed with caution," he said, his sharp gaze piercing her. "This court isn't a place for baseless accusations. I expect any evidence you present to be fully verified per legal procedure." He tapped his gavel lightly, the small sound echoing as a reminder of his authority. Judge William Hayes raised a hand to silence Karoline Leavitt, but she didn't let him interrupt further. She raised her hand, signaling him to stop, then turned to the court clerk. "Sir, please prepare the recorder. I want everyone in this room to hear every word clearly." The courtroom held its breath. The female juror in the blue jacket leaned forward, her eyes wide. Daniel Rivera bowed his head, his hands trembling on the defendant's table. His defense attorney, the man in the gray suit, shot up. "Objection, Your Honor, this doesn't follow legal procedure," he said, his voice tense. But Judge Hayes merely raised a hand, signaling him to sit, his eyes fixed on Leavitt. "Miss Leavitt," Hayes said, his voice low but carrying a warning, "if you intend to present a recording, I expect it to meet this court's rigorous legal standards. I won't tolerate any action that undermines this trial's fairness." He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest, his gaze locked on her. Leavitt gave a faint smile, not to provoke, but to assert her control. "Your Honor, I deeply appreciate your caution," she replied, her voice calm but cutting. "This recording was obtained by the Justice Department through a lawful wiretap. I believe you'll find it meets the standards you require." She nodded to the clerk, who quickly set the recorder on the table and pressed play. A faint static crackled, then Judge Hayes's deep, authoritative voice emerged. "Don't let her find those memos. If she gets evidence, I'll make it disappear before it reaches the court." The courtroom exploded into stunned murmurs. A reporter in the back gasped, "Oh my God," before being pulled back by a colleague. The female juror in the blue jacket covered her mouth, her eyes shifting from shock to outrage. A male juror with salt and pepper hair shook his head slowly, as if unable to believe his ears. Daniel Rivera snapped his head up, his face pale, his panicked eyes darting to his attorney. But all eyes ultimately turned to Judge Hayes. He sat still, his hands gripping the edge of the bench, his gaze fixed on the recorder. His face flushed red, then turned pale as if life had drained from him. "That recording," he spoke, his voice hoarse but striving for dignity, "I demand its origin be reviewed. This court cannot accept evidence without full verification." He tapped his gavel lightly, but the sound was feeble, lacking its usual strength. Leavitt interrupted him, her voice sharp yet respectful. "Your Honor, I deeply respect your request," she said, "but this recording has been verified by the Justice Department. Who were you speaking to in that call? And why did you want to conceal evidence in the very case you're presiding over?" She stepped closer, her eyes fixed on Hayes. He shot to his feet, hands on the bench, his voice deepening with gravity but trembling. "Miss Leavitt, I warn you," he said, his eyes flashing with a rare spark of anger. "I won't allow any action that undermines this trial's fairness. I demand a pause on presenting this recording until it's verified by an independent agency." He struck his gavel harder, the sound echoing through the room as if trying to reclaim control. Leavitt stood still, her gaze unwavering. She knew she'd hit his weak spot, and she wasn't about to stop. "Your Honor," she replied, her voice low but forceful, "if you doubt its authenticity, I welcome a verification, but allow me to proceed with the presentation. Return to your signature on this memo," Karoline Leavitt said, holding up the document again, her eyes locked on Judge William Hayes. "Would you like to explain why your signature appears on an illegal voter purge, or should I let the jury decide for themselves?" Hayes breathed heavily, his chest heaving like a cornered animal. "Ms. Leavitt," he said, his voice low but carrying a warning, "I remind you that I'm the one overseeing this trial. I won't accept any accusations without clear, verified evidence." He struck his gavel again, his gaze sweeping the room as if to assert his control. Leavitt stood tall, her eyes never leaving him. "Your Honor," she said, her voice rising, clear and firm as she turned to the jury, "I deeply respect your role, but your signature on this memo, combined with the recording, reveals a clear truth. There's a conspiracy between Mr. Rivera and a senior official to rig this election. I propose pausing the trial for federal investigators to take over." She stepped back, resting her hand on the table, her eyes fixed on Hayes. The courtroom descended into chaos after Karoline Leavitt's final proposal. Murmurs from the jury mingled with the rapid scribbling of reporters, while Daniel Rivera clutched his head, his hands trembling as if realizing everything had collapsed. Judge Hayes sat at the bench, his eyes glued to the oak table, his face taut with deeper than usual wrinkles. He whispered, "You can't request that." But his voice was weak, lacking the authority that once made him an icon in this courtroom. Leavitt stood firm at the plaintiff's table, her gaze locked on him, awaiting his next move. But before Hayes could regain his composure, the main doors burst open with a loud bang, startling everyone to turn around. Pam Bondi strode in, her presence commanding in a sharp black suit, her blonde hair tied neatly back. Behind her were two Justice Department officers in uniform, handcuffs in hand. Their eyes cold, their heels clicked steadily on the wooden floor, each step like a hammer striking the stifling silence. Leavitt turned, unsurprised. She'd known Bondi was watching from afar, waiting for this moment. Reporters erupted, cameras flashing relentlessly. One shouted, "The Attorney General's here!" But Bondi paid no mind. Her eyes locked on Hayes like a justice enforcer facing a betrayer. "Judge William Hayes," Bondi declared, her voice low but cutting, resonating through the room. "I am Pamela Bondi, United States Attorney General. Under my authority, I declare you under arrest for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit election fraud, and abuse of judicial power." Her words were a final verdict, shattering Hayes's last shred of hope. He snapped his head up, eyes wide with shock, his mouth hanging open. Judge William Hayes stammered as if to protest, but the courtroom exploded in noise. The female juror in the blue jacket shot to her feet, covering her mouth in shock. A male juror with salt and pepper hair whispered to his neighbor, "I knew it, something was off." Daniel Rivera yelled at his attorney, "Do something!" But the attorney just bowed his head, scribbling notes in vain. Reporters surged forward, snapping photos, flashes bursting like fireworks. But Pam Bondi remained steady. She raised a hand, signaling the officers to advance. Hayes stood abruptly, hands on the bench, his voice deepening with gravity but trembling. "Miss Bondi, I must protest this action," he said, his eyes flashing with rare anger. "This is a trial under my direction, and I demand a full explanation before any measures are taken." He tapped his gavel lightly, the faint sound a last-ditch effort to cling to authority. Bondi stepped closer, her cold gaze piercing him. "Mr. Hayes," she replied, her voice low but commanding, "you no longer have the authority to demand anything in this courtroom. Your signature on an illegal memo and the recording obtained by the Justice Department prove you not only knew of Mr. Rivera's voter fraud, but participated in it. You'll have your chance to explain in court, but not here." She nodded to the officers behind her. "Execute the arrest." The two officers stepped forward. One pulled handcuffs from his belt, the other grasping Hayes's shoulder. He jerked back, his voice rising in desperation. "This is a gross violation of legal procedure," he said, his eyes sweeping the room as if seeking support. "I demand to review this arrest warrant before any action is taken." But his resistance faded as the click of the handcuffs rang out, locking his wrists together. The metallic sound was a full stop, echoing in a courtroom now without its judge. Leavitt stood still, watching it all with calm eyes. She'd done her part, exposed the truth, laid the groundwork for Bondi to finish it. Bondi turned to her, giving a slight nod, a brief but meaningful gesture. "Good work, Karoline," she whispered, her voice low enough for only Leavitt to hear. Leavitt smiled faintly, saying nothing. Their coordination needed no words. The Justice Department officers pulled Hayes down from the bench, leading him through the courtroom aisle. He stumbled, head bowed, avoiding the eyes of the jury that once revered him. A reporter shouted, "Judge Hayes, do you have anything to say?" But he didn't respond. The officers' footsteps echoed steadily, blending with the growing murmurs of the crowd. As the side door opened, Hayes glanced back at Leavitt one last time, his eyes filled with resentment. But she stood there, unmoving, a victor without need for boast. The courtroom remained in shock. Rivera sat still, hands clutching his head, his face ashen. His attorney whispered something, but he didn't react. Their plans had gone up in smoke. The jurors exchanged looks, some shaking their heads, others whispering in indignation. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, cameras and phones raised high, flashes bursting to preserve Hayes's handcuffed exit forever. Bondi turned back, facing the courtroom. "This trial is paused until a new judge is appointed," she announced, her voice ringing with authority. "The Justice Department will continue its work to ensure that justice is served." Pam Bondi declared, her voice firm and resolute, "Justice will be served, no matter who's involved." She paused, her gaze sweeping to Daniel Rivera, now shrinking in his seat. "Mr. Rivera, I suggest you prepare yourself. We're not done." The murmurs flared again, but Bondi ignored them. She stepped closer to Karoline Leavitt, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You made history today," she said, her voice low but warm. "Hayes thought he was untouchable, but you proved otherwise." Leavitt nodded, her eyes still sharp. "Thank you, but I know you're the one who sealed it." The side door closed behind Judge William Hayes. the sound of handcuffs echoing like the end of his once powerful career. Karoline Leavitt stood at the plaintiff's table, her gaze piercing, her hand resting lightly on the documents, now historic evidence. Pam Bondi, after ordering Hayes' removal, turned to her with a brief nod, then exited the courtroom with the two Justice Department officers. But the atmosphere didn't settle. It ignited like a freshly lit flame. Daniel Rivera remained at the defendant's table, hands clutching his head, his face as pale as paper. His attorney, the man in the gray suit, whispered something with a tense expression, but Rivera didn't respond. He looked up, his panicked eyes scanning the room, then shouted, "I'll cooperate. I'll tell everything. I swear." His voice cracked, almost pleading, but Leavitt didn't flinch. She turned to him, her voice cold but calm. "Mr. Rivera, you had your chance to do the right thing. Now you'll face the consequences. No deals here." The murmurs from the jury grew louder. The female juror in the blue jacket stood, staring at Rivera with a mix of shock and disdain. A male juror with salt and pepper hair shook his head slowly, whispering to his neighbor, "I suspected something from the start." They were no longer passive observers. They had just witnessed a powerful judge's downfall, and faith in justice began to stir in their eyes. Reporters sprang into action like a swarm of bees from a broken hive. Cameras flashed relentlessly, phones raised to capture every moment. One shouted to a colleague, "Send it now! Hayes arrested in court! This is front-page news!" Another posted on X, "Karoline Leavitt exposes Judge Hayes' election fraud. Pam Bondi cuffs him on the spot. Justice prevails." Within minutes, the post spread with thousands of likes and comments. "Leavitt and Bondi are an unstoppable duo. Finally, justice is served." Leavitt glanced at the crowd, knowing this story would reach far beyond this room. She turned back to the table, gathering her documents with remarkable calm. The court clerk, a middle-aged man with round glasses, approached, his voice trembling. "Miss Leavitt, I've never seen anything like this. Do you need me to record anything else?" She smiled faintly, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Just write it all down as it happened. The truth is enough." He nodded, returning to his desk, still visibly shaken. In the hallway, Pam Bondi stood waiting, arms crossed, her sharp eyes watching the reporters trying to get close. When Leavitt stepped out, Bondi motioned her over. "You shook the system today," she said, her voice low but proud. "Hayes is not the only one. We need to dig deeper. Rivera's just the start." Leavitt nodded, gripping her documents tightly. "I'm ready." "I agree, ma'am," the officer said, his voice tight. "He just offered to cooperate. Should we consider it?" Pam Bondi frowned, thinking for a moment before replying, "No. He chose this path and now he faces full accountability. I'll order an expanded investigation immediately. Everyone tied to Hayes will be exposed." She paused, looking Karoline Leavitt straight in the eye. "You exceeded my expectations, Karoline. The president will be pleased with you." Leavitt smiled, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. "Thank you, but I know you're the one who sealed it." Bondi chuckled softly, a rare but warm smile crossing her face. "We're a team. You opened the door, I kicked it wide open. Now go brief the president, I'll handle the rest." She patted Leavitt's shoulder, then turned to signal the Justice Department officers to proceed. Leavitt nodded, stepping into the hallway, feeling the weight of what had just transpired. Outside the courthouse, a crowd began to gather. News of Hayes' arrest had spread fast, and people flocked in, some holding phones to record, others shouting, "Justice for the people." A middle-aged woman in a red coat yelled to a reporter, "It's time to clean out this corruption." The air buzzed with excitement, with outrage. The public had long awaited a moment like this. On social media, the hashtag #LeavittBondi began trending, with tens of thousands of posts praising the two women who took down Hayes. One user wrote, "Karoline Leavitt, just 27, made a judge pay the price. This is the future of justice." Another added, "Pam Bondi shows no mercy. She's a nightmare for the corrupt." Leavitt didn't have time to check her phone, but she knew what she and Bondi had just done would change how people viewed the justice system. She stepped out of the courthouse, sunlight hitting her youthful yet resolute face. A reporter rushed forward, thrusting a microphone toward her. "Ms. Leavitt, how do you feel seeing Judge Hayes arrested?" She paused, looking straight into the camera. I feel justice has been served. This isn't about me or Miss Bondi. It's about the American people who deserve honesty and transparency. She turned away before they could ask more, walking to her car with a calm demeanor. Karoline Leavitt climbed into the black SUV parked outside the courthouse, sunlight streaming through the windows, illuminating her youthful but determined face. The chants for justice from the crowd outside faded as the car door slammed shut. Leavitt closed her eyes for a second, letting the stillness envelop her, but inside her mind, everything still swirled. The image of Judge Hayes in handcuffs, Daniel Rivera's panicked eyes, and Pam Bondi's commanding presence entering the courtroom played like a relentless reel. She knew today wasn't just a personal victory. It was a bold statement from the Trump administration. Justice would be served, no matter who stood in the way. The driver, a White House security agent, glanced through the rearview mirror. "Straight to the White House, ma'am," he said quietly. Leavitt nodded, her voice soft but firm. "Yes, I need to see the president." The car pulled away from the courthouse, where the crowd still gathered, holding phones to record and shouting her and Bondi's names. On the drive, she pulled out her phone. The screen lit up with a flood of X notifications. One post stood out. Karoline Leavitt and Pam Bondi just took down a corrupt judge and exposed a massive election fraud. This is what real justice looks like. Down goes Judge Hayes. This is how we make America great again. Leavitt Bondi trended everywhere. Karoline Leavitt smiled faintly, not for the praise, but for the deeper meaning of this triumph. At the White House, she walked down the long hallway, her heels clicking on the marble floor. She was led straight to the Oval Office, where Donald Trump sat behind his desk, his sharp eyes looking up as she entered. He stood, a wide smile spreading across his face, a rare but genuine one. "Karoline," he said, his voice warm and deep, "you made big things happen today." Hayes cuffed right in court. "I watched it live. Outstanding." He came around the desk, clapping her shoulder like a proud father. Leavitt dipped her head slightly, maintaining her professionalism. "Thank you, sir, but I didn't do it alone. Miss Bondi sealed it." Trump laughed loudly, the sound echoing in the room. "Bondi is a warrior, no doubt, but you, Karoline, you started it. I picked you because I knew you had the strength to change things." He pointed at her, his eyes blazing. "Today proves our slogan, make America great again. You and Bondi just sent that message to every crook thinking they can dodge justice." She nodded, feeling the weight of his praise. "We're not done, sir. Rivera's cooperating, but Miss Bondi thinks there are more involved." Trump furrowed his brow, thinking for a second before nodding. "Good. Don't stop. I want them all dragged into the light. Every last one. You and Bondi keep going. I've got your backs." He returned to his chair, sitting with a satisfied air. "Now go rest. You've earned it." Leavitt left the Oval Office, relieved but not fully at ease. She knew, with Trump, this was just the beginning. As she stepped outside, her phone buzzed. A text from Bondi flashed on the screen. Rivera named some names. "Meet me tomorrow at 7 a.m., my office." She smiled, slipping the phone back into her pocket. Bondi never stopped fighting, and neither would Leavitt. But before diving into the next battle, she needed a moment to herself. The car took her to her home in suburban Washington, D.C., where warm yellow light spilled from the windows. Stepping inside, she heard her 8-month-old son's laughter as he played with her mother in the living room. Ellen, her mom, looked up as she entered. "Karoline, you've been on TV all day. Your son kept pointing at the screen every time he saw you." Leavitt smiled, kicking off her shoes and kneeling beside the boy. She hugged him, feeling his tiny warmth in her arms. "You watched me all day?" she asked, her voice soft. "Thanks so much, Mom," she added, looking at her mother. Ellen waved a hand, smiling kindly. "Don't say that. You're doing big things out there." "I'm just holding down the fort." She paused, looking at Leavitt with proud eyes. "You remind me of when you were little, always steadfast, always fighting for what's right. Today, you did that for the whole country." Leavitt bowed her head, emotions welling up. She kissed her son's forehead, whispering, "I do it all for you, you know that." That night, after her son slept, Leavitt sat alone in her small study. She opened her laptop, scrolling through X posts. Tens of thousands were talking about the case, about her, Bondi, Hayes. One post made her pause. Karoline Leavitt isn't just press secretary, she's a symbol of a new generation proving youth can change the system. She closed her eyes, letting the words sink in, but then she thought of Rivera, the names Bondi would reveal, and what was still left to be uncovered. This fight was far from over. The pressure of her role as press secretary wasn't just about speaking to the public. It was about standing up for what she believed in, even with the world watching. She stood, stepping onto the balcony and gazing at Washington's night sky. A cool breeze swept through her hair, bringing with it a mix of freedom and responsibility. Her mind flashed to Hayes being led away, his resentful glare from their final exchange earlier in the courtroom. He'd said, "I demand a full explanation before any measures are taken," his deep voice stern, clinging to a judge's authority. But he had failed. She wasn't afraid, never had been, yet she knew the road ahead would be tough. Her phone buzzed again, another text from Pam Bondi. "The list is longer than I thought. Tomorrow at 7 a.m. Be ready. The bigger fight's coming." Leavitt typed back quickly, "I'll be there." She pocketed the phone, breathing in the night air. She thought of Trump and his promise of a more transparent America. She thought of her son, sleeping peacefully next door, and the future she wanted him to grow up in. Today was a win, but not the end. It was just the start of a long fight. She stepped back inside, closing the balcony door, her eyes blazing with resolve. Tomorrow she'd meet Bondi and they'd press on. Hayes had fallen, Rivero was talking, but there were others out there, those who thought they could escape. Leavitt smiled, a cold but confident smile. They wouldn't hide for long. She and Bondi would find them, one by one, and justice wouldn't stop. From my perspective, this story of Karoline Leavitt taking down Judge Hayes hits hard, because it shows how one person's courage can unravel corruption hiding in plain sight. I believe it's a wake-up call. Our systems aren't flawless, and when power goes unchecked, it's the everyday American who pays the price. Leavitt and Bondi's teamwork proves that fighting for justice isn't just noble, it's necessary. Maybe you see it the same way, a spark of hope that the little guy can still win. Or maybe you think it's too dramatic, that the system's too broken for one courtroom win to matter. I get that skepticism. Sometimes it feels like we're shouting into the void. But to me, this isn't just a story. It's a reminder that change starts with those bold enough to act. What do you think? Are Leavitt and Bondi heroes, or is this just noise in a messy world? Drop your thoughts below. I'd love to hear your take, whether you agree or not. Thanks so much for watching, folks. Hit that subscribe button, like, and share to keep the conversation going. See you next time. This is a story I've adapted from YouTube. Please note that this content is presented under YouTube's fair use guidelines for educational and commentary purposes, ensuring no copyright infringement when uploaded to YouTube. The main character is Karoline Leavitt.